Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, people of all ages, brothers and sisters. Welcome to Freedom Side Know Your Power web chat. This week's web chat is on the topic of education. My name is Scott Roberts. Follow me on Twitter at Scott Gets Busy. I want to quickly welcome everyone to this web chat. This web chat is hosted by Freedom Side. Freedom Side is a national network of organizers and organizations working to better the lives of young people of color across communities, across movements, and we are working in four issue areas, those being education, criminalization, democracy and voting rights, and jobs and economic justice. In the lead up to the election day in November, we're trying to focus people and change the conversation of the debate to focus on the issues affecting the lives of young people of color. This week's web chat is on the topic of education, and we've got a fantastic panel of organizers working on education issues, working with young people of color, they themselves being young people of color, and trying to deal with the issue of education. So briefly, before I introduce our panel, I just want to give a little context to folks about race and education in the U.S. Where's that information? Well, we're here to talk about several issues such as funding of education, the school-to-prison pipeline, and school privatization, school closings. Here's my 14 facts, courtesy of the nation, on race and education. Black students accounted for 18% of the country's pre-K enrollment, but made up 48% of preschoolers with multiple out-of-school suspensions. Black students were expelled at 3 times the rate of white students. American Indian and Native Alaskan students represent less than 1% of students, but 3% of expulsions. Black girls are suspended at higher rates than all other girls and most boys across racial and ethnic lines. American Indian and Native Alaskan girls are suspended at higher rates than white boys or girls. Nearly 1 in 4 boys of color with disabilities receive an out-of-school suspension. 1 in 5 girls of color with disabilities receive an out-of-school suspension. A quarter of schools with the highest percentage of Black and Latino students do not offer Algebra 2. A third of those schools don't offer chemistry. Less than half of American Indian and Native Alaskan high school students have access to the full range of math and science courses, including Algebra 1, Geometry, Algebra 2, Calculus, Biology, Chemistry, and Physics. Black and Latino students accounted for 40% of enrollment at schools with gifted programs, but somehow only make up 26% of students in those programs. Black, Latino, and Native American students attended schools with higher concentrations of first-year teachers than white students. Black students were more than 3 times likely to attend school, and fewer than 60% of teachers meet all state certification and licensure requirements. And Latino students were twice as likely to attend those schools. So there's stark differences in the education experiences that people of color are experiencing in the U.S., and we're here to talk with this panel about why those differences exist, what can be done about them, what they are doing with their organizations on the ground, and really to talk about what we really want to see out of education and how they can, how we can end the prison pipeline and turn it into the school to power pipeline. So we'll begin with a brief round of introductions, and these folks will be sharing more about themselves and their work as we continue. First, we have Amatala Mervin, who is a organizer with the Boston Youth Organizing Project, the National Student Bill of Rights campaign, and the Alliance for Educational Justice. Also, we have Charles Taylor, calling in from Jackson, Mississippi. He is an organizer with the Better Schools, Better Jobs ballot initiative campaign, which will be sharing more of that with us. And we also have Jonathan Stith, National Coordinator of the Alliance for Educational Justice. AEJ, as we call it, is a national coalition group of youth organizing organizations throughout the country. And finally, we have Nafisa and Dahira Malik, who are 15-year-old rising 10th graders in Columbus, Ohio. They are youth organizers with the Ohio Student Association. Really excited to have those young people with us on the call today. So I wanted to actually start with the topic of education funding. Charles is here representing the Better Schools, Better Jobs campaign, and they're working on an initiative to fully fund education in Mississippi. Charles, can you tell us more about that work and what you all are doing and why?
How's everybody doing? Hey, I'm Charles Taylor from Jackson, Mississippi, and as Scott said, I'm one of the field directors for Better Schools, Better Jobs. And Better Schools, Better Jobs is a hub for a campaign that essentially want to do two things. We want to make free public education a constitutional right in the state of Mississippi, and also full funding of education a constitutional right in the state. As it stands now, education in the state of Mississippi, when it comes to it being a constitutional right, it's prescribed by the legislators. And so for many, many, many years, legislators have played with education in the state of Mississippi, especially in communities of colors. I think about a quote that Charlie Cobb used in 1963 in December, and he talked about education. It is, I believe, it's universally known that education in Mississippi is grossly inadequate for blacks and whites compared to the rest of the nation. Well, we're here in 2014, over 50 years later, and Charlie Cobb's statement during Freedom Summer is just as true now. And one of those big reasons for education being so bad in Mississippi is funding. We have a lot of funding problems. In 1997, the state legislators adopted the Mississippi Adequate Education Program formula. And this formula was an equity formula, and it was a direct response to a lot of southern states being sued because they didn't fund education as they should have. So they created this formula to say how much they should fund education in the state of Mississippi. That was in 1997. Since 1997, that formula has only been funded twice. And when they underfunded, they typically underfunded by $300 million. Well, that means a whole lot in a state of 3 million people. And so when we look at the state of education in Mississippi and it being underfunded, it creates this dichotomy where if you're a wealthy county, you then can supplement when the state underfunds education and you have great educational systems. But if you're a poorer county, the state of Mississippi underfunds you and you don't have enough money to provide an adequate education for the children. You know, if you're looking at give you an example, looking at a tax mill in Holmes County, which is a very, very poor county, a county of color, a tax mill represents $18,000, whereas a tax mill in Madison County, which is a suburb of Jackson, which is a wealthy white county, that same tax mill would represent $1.4 million. So we're talking about drastic gaps in terms of educational funding on a county level. That's why we believe the state should fully fund education. It's really sad because if you go around in some of the schools in Mississippi, the issues are just extreme. Teachers are being underpaid, dilapidated conditions of the building. Students, if they don't have may not have books to go home with, and those who have books in the classroom, sometimes you find a scenario where every student in the class does not have a book. And so, you know, some basic things like not having books, you know, how can you say you can adequately educate a child if you can't even provide the resources for him or her to be educated? And it's really sad because it even goes even further. You go into some of the bathrooms, and no soap, and no toilet tissue. So it's a issue that crosses not just education but healthcare, and then also tied to the wealth of of a community. You know, our organization is called Better Schools, Better Jobs, and the linkage that we're trying to create between education and jobs is simply that, you know, it is your tax base that allows you to increase educational funding. Well, the only way for you to have a healthy tax base is to have a healthy educational system, is to have a educated workforce. And in the state of Mississippi, it sold itself as a cheap labor state for so long that we still see these same issues happening. It's really interesting because you know, Mississippi had more people of color than any other state in the country in terms of percentage, and so this is a deep-rooted issue, I think, not just in Mississippi, but within communities of color. You look at education, I mean, look at educational funding and education as a fundamental right as something that needs to be needed. Education is probably the most foundational thing to build a thriving, living, healthy community. And so when we look at a lot of these social justice issues, I feel like they start with education. It's interesting because, like you said, Mississippi has always been at the bottom in just about everything good, and at the top of everything bad. And so starting this conversation in Mississippi about full funding education and making it a constitutional right, I think will segue into the nation starting to have this conversation, or it may progress the timeline in which we start moving towards a national movement of a fully funded and fundamental right to education. The last thing I wanted to mention is it's interesting. A lot of our support for this initiative is from the Republican Party and from you know, older white people, and it's because they're frustrated too. They understand that as long as Mississippi sells itself as a cheap labor state, then we cannot progress. And if we don't have a adequate education system, then we can do nothing but sell ourselves as a cheap cheap labor state. Uh, Thank you, Scott.
Oh no, thank you,
Oh,
Charles.
no, thank you, Charles.
All right, we gotta get you back. Thank you, Erica. May is behind the scenes um, working our technical issues, and I appreciate that. But Charles, thank you for that. That was really extensive response in terms of the work that you all are doing and some of the key issues that are at play. And you know, I think let's stay here on this issue of education funding. I think you said a couple things that I think are really important. First of all, some of those examples of, you know, folks not having access to soap and toilet tissue, things like that in bathrooms. I mean, it just says to me that when we're not fully funding education, this literally can be a dehumanizing experience for people. And then it's connected to other issues, like you said, like healthcare and jobs. I would say it's connected to you know, the issue of mass incarceration as well. You know, when we don't educate folks, we see what happens. But one of the important things that you said was that the work that you all are doing, you see it being connected to the emergence of a national movement calling for the full funding of education and really the ability to provide an adequate education for every young person. I wanted to ask, especially Jonathan and Amatala, I know that AEJ, which both of you all are core organizers in that coalition, brought young people to Mississippi for the 50th anniversary of the Freedom Summer, where Charles was one of our hosts, and we really appreciate that. And you all got your young people trained up to help canvass around the Better Schools, Better Jobs effort. And just wondering how you all see that campaign and the general idea of investing in education as connected to racial justice and improving conditions for young people of color. Go ahead, Jonathan.
Oh, I thought I was gonna yield to I was gonna go even before age and let Amantala go first.
She waved you off. Go ahead, bro.
You waved me off.
You can go ahead.
All right. So I think for us in the alliance, when we look at 60 years ago, the ruling of Brown versus Board of Ed, that the separate and unequal was a question around funding and state funding of education and the discrimination that existed, and the need for the federal government to, one, just protect education as a fundamental right, which is supposed to be which still we have to wrestle with, and I think that's some of the amazing work that's happening with the National Student Bill of Rights. So for us coming to Mississippi, and particularly at the time of the 50th anniversary of Freedom Summer, one of the things that we were clear that came out of Freedom Summer was the idea of freedom schools and this idea of the seed of kind of education justice, and the work that we do 50 years later is directly connected to that in a lot of different ways. And so part of it was, and then what we've seen over the last couple of years is that funding equity is an issue that's not only based in Mississippi, that we see the issue in California, in Illinois, the terrible set of conditions happening in Philadelphia, in the state of Pennsylvania, even some stuff happening in the state of New York. And so our intent was really to come to Mississippi to learn and to see a potential solution to address the issue of funding equity, and also what it meant to build out statewide campaigns for that, which was also one of the things that they attempted to do 50 years ago, was to build statewide student youth organizing groups to forward this idea of education justice, and saw that as the mechanism to do that. And it definitely goes back to this idea of whose education matters, and who pays for it, and like some of what we've seen is this kind of two education systems that have been created, and they're both unequal and at this point really both underfunded.
So I think that there were a plethora of things that we were going down, as Jonathan said, to sort of think about. And I think that one of the things that was very important to us was, if we had access, right, to our own money, what would it look like for us to move it? Right? So for instance, if we had our budget and we were able to think about where we would put it, would we put it in metal detectors, or would we put it in restorative justice practices, right, and models within our schools? And so we asked young people and had them sort of think about where would you put that money, and is money really the issue, right? Because a part of it, yes, is funding is a problem, but we also know that poor people all of our lives and all of our generations have worked with what we have. And so to some degree there's sort of a struggle, I think, with a portion of us and another portion of us to say, well, if we had the money, does everybody believe we should be doing the same thing with it, right? And so I think that's where we also thought about community schools being an important sort of mechanism in how we ran schools within our community, because there's something around, regardless of whether we have the money or not, we're going to teach young people, right? And we're going to be able to inform them of the things that are important to their lives and their ability to grow as young people. I think that also one of the bigger things that came out of Freedom Summer and going down there and thinking about education and what it's looked like for the past 50 years was thinking about, how does Freedom Summer look as a catalyst for the plenty of movements that we're involved in, right? So for the National Student Bill of Rights, it was important for us to think about, how is Freedom Summer a catalyst for NSBR, and how do we begin to look at the legacy that was built and that was moved to sort of push our movements? Does it mean that we need a political party, right, in sort of lieu of how they managed to go about that piece? Do we need a ballot initiative? What does that look like for young people, and how do young people have the ability to identify what's important for them? Because if you put money in front of them, it means a lot, right? But they're going to share it. You can't give, it's almost impossible that you're going to give one young person or any human being, you know, that cares about people and loves people a set of monies, and they're not going to support their people. So I think when it's connected to monetary value, thinking about, like, how do we implement these things socially first before we even get, you know, to a place of being able to identify what we do with the money, or how it would be dispersed among us and what have you, which doesn't go to, I'm not saying that we shouldn't have the money or the ability to move it, but it's important to think about how do we identify with education in a way that's inclusive, and young people have access to sort of transforming themselves without things like money and power and prestige.
Well, thank you, Amata. I actually want to stay with you because you mentioned an SBR, and I'm hoping that you can explain to folks watching who may not be familiar with that campaign, what that is, and why it's important. What is an SBR?
Okay, so the National Student Bill of Rights is an entity of 15 rights that was created over the course of several years. It began in 2009 in Houston, Texas, at Free Minds, Free People. I could give the history of how it came about, but that might be a little bit long. So where we are now is a place of thinking about what an SBR looks like to every young person. And so the rights include the right to free quality public education, the right to have sustainable health care, the right to have sustainable housing that's safe, the right to have restorative justice practices within your schools and within your community. And these are just snippets of the 15 rights that we've sort of identified as young people are important to sort of the wholesomeness of the young person. And so the idea is one of two things. We believe fundamentally that culture is sort of the baseline of where we need to implement all of these rights, right? So policy follows culture. It's one of those things that we keep sort of reiterating to people in a way that's been important to us. So for instance, if a young person is in a school and they are getting searched and seized by the administrators in the school, we believe that someone should be able to take their National Student Bill of Rights and say, as a collective group, like as their peers, you don't have a right to do that because this is right number so-and-so, right? And so it's important for us to think about and sort of hone in on our collective visioning around where NSBR stands sort of as a cultural policy for ourselves, and then how it could be translated into federal law or federal legislation. And so I think that young people are in a place of a condition based out of fear and hurt, and it makes it hard for people to be able to say, like, well, I have a right to something, because so many rights have been violated, right? So, and we believe that NSBR gives sort of young people the mass amount of rights, right, for them to be able to think about how do I state the right, how do I implement the right within myself and my community, and then how do I begin to push it and use it as a base building formula across the board.
Sorry, having a little trouble with the mute button there. Thanks, Amasala. I actually wanted to ask you one quick follow-up question around the rights that are included in the National Student Bill of Rights. I know there are like 15 different portions of it, so we probably can't do the whole list, but if there were, say, 2 or 3 of them that you think are really are key or are just really good examples of what it's in the National Student Bill of Rights, can you give us a couple examples of things that you all are calling for?
So first, let me say that it depends on where you are and the importance of it. I think that in some places, for instance, like we've seen a heightened sort of idea around being frisked and stopped in New York, and although that's sort of been the grounds for where we talk about being stopped and frisked, a lot of other places are dealing with it. So I think that's the first one, is not being searched and seized. I think that across the board, Black and brown young people, both men and women, are being searched and seized. I think that oftentimes we forget that young women, this is happening to them, but because it often comes with sexual assault, we're not able to talk about it. And so I think across the board it's happening to young people in that way. I think the second thing is being able to have relevant curriculum, curriculum that is culturally sound for you and your community, connected to maybe here in the States, but also across, nations, right? So if I'm not originally from here, or if I am originally from here, but I want to know a history of another culture, I think that that's important for people to feel connected to their culture and many cultures around them. And then I think the third one would be being able to have restorative practices within your schools and your communities. Part of the reason why we don't deal with conflict effectively is because we don't do it as a community. Someone comes in and tells us how to do it, and then we kind of just say, well, we're putting our hands up and they can deal with it as they feel is fit, right? But that's not the right method. And if we don't deal with it, then it becomes a whole bigger issue, and then young people are dying at the hands of us, like, completely.
All right. Thank you, Matala. Just got a text from Charles saying that he might have a question himself. I just want, before we come to you, Charles, want to definitely say, of course, panelists, if you have a question for another panelist or for the whole panel, feel free to ask it. Also, I forgot to say this earlier, we want to ask folks who are watching, if you want to join the conversation, you can join us on Twitter. Freedom Side can be reached on Twitter at Freedom Side. But you can also just use the hashtag Know Your Power, hashtag Know Your Power, and include any question or comment, and we will try to read off some of those throughout the rest of the web chat. So, Charles, do you have a question?
Yeah, I had a question about the National Bill of Rights. Do you see it as a vehicle to empower students and make them feel like, okay, I do have rights, this is how I should be treated, and that's like something, a mentality that they adopt, or do you see it more as a vehicle to push legislation towards these things?
So to be honest, I think it's both and. On the initial sort of push and initial front, I think that we are clear that young people and people have to embrace anything that comes into their spacing, right, for themselves first, before it can be pushed on any policy level. Like I sort of started with, was that it, like, cultural, if you start to identify something culturally, then you can put it into policy. But if you don't believe in it within yourself and within your community, then you can't push it anywhere else. It's just not the way, it works. Like the founding fathers, they pushed these things because it was important to the people, supposedly, right? So I think that it has to begin with young people identifying their leadership through the National Student Bill of Rights, realizing that they have sort of these rights for themselves first, and then they'll have the ability to base, build, and move from there. And of course, it looks different in every state, but nationally, that's what we essentially hold true to ourselves, that it should be held within you and within your community first. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you so much. Really quickly, I had a follow-up question. So, was there ever any discussion about pushing one of the rights, or has it always been a consensus that you push all of them at the same time?
We fight a lot about, and with young people across the board, what should get pushed, because one of our rights is, for instance, free college education. And a lot of people are like, wait a second, they're going to look at you crazy, right? So some people believe that we should just push one, and that's been sort of the thought process. However, we believe that if we're going to go big, we might as well go big, right? And then we also believe that if you don't have all of these things as a young person, we're not creating a wholesome young person, right? Like, we're not helping you to be the best that you can be, because you may have housing, but you may not have good food in your home, right? So how does that translate to how you act in school, or how your parents speak to you, or what have you, and your nutrition connected to the plenty of things that come with that. But however, I will say the other sort of piece to that is, if you see the National Student Bill of Rights and what's important to you is restorative justice in your schools, and you want to push just that right, by all means, we'll support it. And we believe that we can't just tell everybody we're going to push all of them and you have to, right? Because we got to meet you where you're at, and you got to meet us where we're at. And we believe we can push for all of them nationally, but sometimes on the local level you have to push what you can with what resources you have and where your people are at.
All right, thanks, Amasala. Yeah, it's a little lag there in the muting, but and Charles, thank you for those questions. There are some other folks who had questions for you online, Amasala. You ready for those? And they're bothly. I see a couple folks who have sent in a couple tweets around the National Student Bill of Rights. We got Lindsay who has tweeted, and Kevin Shaw. So, pardon me, brother, if I mispronounce your name. But they are both. Kevin appears to be a teacher, asking if there is a link to the National Student Bill of Rights that he can share with his students, or is that too preliminary? And the other question is from Lindsay, saying the Student Bill of Rights is such a powerful idea. We agree. Her question is, how do I find where it stands in my community? So I guess the overall question, Amasala, that a couple folks have on Twitter is, how can they get involved? How do they access the Student Bill of Rights, where it is in the process right now? They're kind of just practical questions. Any responses to those?
Of course. So thank you for your tweets. We really appreciate it. First, so I think the first answer is yes, there is a way for you to get connected. But first, the one thing that we really encourage teachers, parents, community members, anyone to do is get young people to vote. So the National Student Bill of Rights identifies young people as 12 to 25. So anybody who is within that age, if you can vote, I mean, we appreciate younger too, of course. So have them vote, and you can go to projectsouth.org, and there's a little ballot that says the National Student Bill of Rights. You click on it and it'll bring you to where you can have young people vote on all 15 rights. They can vote and say they specifically want 5 or 10 or what have you. But getting young people to vote is probably not only represents democracy, right, and their ability to be a part of that, but represents their ability to have power in a process that they're usually not a part of, right, especially if they're under the age of 18. And then to the second question, I believe it was, how do people sort of become engaged? Is that the right question? I just want to make sure.
Yeah, I think they're both generally trying to figure out how people can be engaged, but primarily I think that the second question from Lindsay was, how can you kind of see where your community stands up with the National Student Bill of Rights, if that makes sense?
Okay, so first I suggest that you look at the rights and ask any questions that you have about them. The second thing I would say is that there is going to be at least 3 rights that you're like, I can hit that on the nail. I believe that that's important to my community, hands down. It doesn't matter if you're in Alaska or wherever you're located. Young people and students are going to be connected to these things. So I think the first thing is to be able to look at all of the rights, have students and young people identify which rights are important to them, and then begin the conversation around how you can move to gain those rights, which may look different in each place. It may be sort of a local fight, it may be a regional fight, depending on where you are and what that looks like for you.
Jonathan, were you going to add something there? You just popped up on my screen. I'm not sure if that was because you wanted to add something or not.
Nah, it's just my juice.
All right. Well, I appreciate that. Thanks, Amata. Thanks for the questions. Folks, again, if you have questions for the panel and tonight's web chat, you can send them with the hashtag #KnowYourPower. And right now, I kind of want to pivot to an issue that is really prevalent in terms of the concern that folks have around it within the freedom side, both from an individual and organizational standpoints, and that's the school to prison pipeline. We've touched on it a bit some already. Amasal had mentioned it as trying to address issues of school discipline and school security in the National Student Bill of Rights. We're really fortunate tonight to have on Nafisa and Bahira Malik from the Ohio Student Association. They're a couple of high school students that are active in youth organizing in Columbus around the school to prison pipeline. And Nafisa and Bahira, I'm just hoping that you all can share a little bit about the campaign that's happening in Ohio and the work that you all have been doing there and why.
Okay, so, well, I'm Bahira, and basically what we're doing is like getting the youth involved in like in laws that like affect them, like school to prison pipeline, zero tolerance, and just on Wednesday the high schoolers organized a rally and march to the state house to to rally against the zero tolerance and like give our view of it. And a couple students, we interviewed them and they told stories about when they were like suspended or expelled for little things like talking out, being late, and stuff like that.
And just a quick follow-up question. There's a lot of issues in education, and I think it's interesting, whether it's with you and other high school students that are active with the Ohio Student Association, or the dozens of groups that are part of the Alliance for Educational Justice. You see this really concentrated effort from the actual young people who are in our schools today, asking for solutions on the school to prison pipeline. And I'm wondering why you think it is, why this issue, amongst all the other things, is important to you all, to the Ohio Student Association, and what's the importance of your voice as high school students in this fight?
Because mostly it's mostly the adults speaking for the kids. These kids don't usually have a voice until when they or think about things that happen. So the youth in our group, we get together and like organize things that affect us. And the school to prison pipeline and zero tolerance is a big thing because education is like the biggest thing in somebody's life, and that's what they need. But you get kicked out for small things that really you don't need to be kicked out for, and you're missing out on education that you do need, and it's just leading you onto not a good road.
Cool, thank you. And then I want to come back to you, Jonathan. I mean, AEJ, the Alliance for Educational Justice, pretty much formed around this issue of school to prison pipeline, right? And I wonder if you can, just give people a little bit of the story of the movement to end the school to prison pipeline as it pertains to the coming together of Alliance for Educational Justice. Then, what are youth groups that you work with around the country doing to deal with the school to prison pipeline?
Absolutely. For a lot of us, the fight around ending the school to prison pipeline really has its roots in the 80s and the early 90s, around a lot of the fights, particularly in California, around the criminalization of young people, and the efforts to defund education and fund mass incarceration. I think for us it came to a culmination with the national policy of zero tolerance that set the stage for states to create these sets of laws that are now creating the racial disparities that we see in discipline. With it, I think it also particularly reflected a particular view of young people, or young people of color and black youth, as predators, and that has been part of the work to undo that. So for the Alliance, we came together in 2008, and part of our dialogue was that we would sit with each other and talk about our work and we would all have victories, but they would all be limited by federal policy, or at least that's what local decision makers and state decision makers would say. You know, this is a really great policy program. I would love to do it, but no child left behind, zero tolerance policies, federal policies say that we have to do this, that we have to treat our students that way. And so for us, it was like, if we're going to continue to win and build locally, that we needed to really address federal policy, and saw an opportunity with the reauthorization, and also what we perceived to be a friendly administration in the Obama administration, that really has an opportunity to really push them and to maybe push for some new policies around that. I think where we've landed with the Federal Department of Education releasing federal guidelines, I think is a step in the right direction. I think we were looking for something bigger, but then you also have the Secretary Arnie Duncan saying at the beginning of the year that, you know, dismantling the school to prison pipeline should be the daily task. I think young people should take him to heart and make deconstructing the school to prison pipeline your everyday work. You should be writing history papers on the school to prison pipeline, doing math problems to figure out how to solve how many kids are getting suspended and how many we need to stop to solve the racial disparities. I think in your history, in science classes, studying it from that angle, from all angles, using every possible means to really dismantle that. And I think you also saw that with the Obama administration actually giving life, saying school to prison pipeline. I remember when I first started doing this work, and we talked about school to prison pipeline, there was, you know, vehement opposition to it, that it did not exist, that these were just bad kids, these were just super predators and gangbangers, and that they were unworthy of education. And now we've seen that dialogue switch, where we're clear that it's not the students, that's the adults, and that, as Judith Brown from the Advancement Project says, we really have to deal with these micro-duns in our classrooms and in our schools that are denying young people of color a right to an education in our schools. So that's our work.
All right, thanks. It's crucial, like the work that's going on around the country against the school to prison pipeline. One of the groups that is really active on this issue has been the Gay Straight Alliance Network, and we invited them to participate in tonight's chat, and I think due to some technical difficulties, they're not weren't able to get on. But I just want to say that it's really pertinent. It's a commitment that we've made internally in the freedom side, to make sure that we're putting a queer lens onto our analysis of the issues affecting our community, especially in our 4 issue areas of criminalization, education, voting rights, and economic justice and jobs. And Jonathan Amato, I know AEJ has worked closely with Gay Straight Alliance Network on these issues. But I'm wondering just really if any of our panelists could give a little bit of help folks gain a little bit of understanding on how the school to prison pipeline especially affects queer youth of color in particular. We know that, you know, there are particular effects that it has on queer youth of color with disabilities. So really, this is like an open question to the panel around those issues.
Well, we have.
Go ahead, y'all.
No, Monta, let's go.
I think that was Nafisa and Bahira. Y'all go ahead.
Okay, we have one of the students with us with the House Student Association, and on Wednesday she told a story of when she was suspended because she was black, and and I guess the teacher didn't like her, and she got suspended because she openly told everybody that she was gay.
Yeah, for us, and I work with the GSA, it has been around 2 issues. I think one of the areas that we came together, I think rather brilliantly around, was the anti-bullying laws. And so they were trying to use the bullying of LGBTQ students and create more punitive policies. And so GSA really stepped up real big and said, you know, that we want this bullying behavior to end. But we don't want to push more students in the school to prison pipeline, and that we understand that there's a better approach, that we want justice, we want transformation, and really answering that call. And then I think, like the sisters in Columbus talked about, that we're clear that when we look at some of the reasons that young people, particularly black and brown youth, get suspended for, it is like willful defiance and understanding the heterosexism that exists in our schools and our communities. Willful defiance can be non-gender conforming, refusing to honor what a teacher tells you you need to wear pants to school the next day, and you decide you want to show up in a dress. Now you're willful defiance, and you're potentially in line for suspension. So it touches one of us, it touches all of us, and I think for young people, what they're clear is that they're a community, and that they're going to fight and solve this issue together. And we can't forget about immigrant youth as well.
I would just say that I think to sort of piggyback off of what Jonathan is saying is that along with the punitive sort of policies that take place, like within the school, that tell you can't dress a certain way if you supposedly look a certain way or what have you, there's an emotional toll that takes on young people. It takes an emotional toll on anyone if you walk into a space and you're not welcomed based on what you wear or how you look, right? And so what happens is, aside from just policy, people's ideologies can push a young person out of a school. And that is one of the worst things that could possibly happen, because if you can identify it as like a policy sort of thing, like there's a rule in a school and that person went against the rule, and so then it looks like they just left the school just because, but in actuality they were hurt and disrespected, and they had to leave because they weren't safe. And so I think there's something around safety and young people, especially in the queer community, being safe in schools and feeling like I can be here with my heterosexual peers, right, and have the same education and feel like my person is valued as well. And that's considered, in this number of dropout rates, which really it's a sort of push-out mechanism that we don't talk about a lot of times because it's emotional, and it doesn't come with like, you got this amount of suspensions, right? But it comes with like, I didn't feel safe, so I didn't go back to that school because the teacher was telling me to wear a skirt. You know what I mean? So I think it's, I think there's a bunch of layers to it. And I think GSA could probably address that, and the queer young people could address that way better than we did, but I hope we hit the surface a little bit.
Yeah, and I want.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to echo the sentiments of everybody else. When I think of school to prison pipeline, the biggest thing it does is body policing, whether that's how you look, how you like to express yourself, or what do you do. And so, thinking about it within a queer lens, I know in Mississippi a few years ago, there was a young lady who wanted to attend her school prom with her girlfriend, and so she fought and fought and fought. And first they said they couldn't go. She couldn't attend it with her girlfriend. So then they finally said, okay, we'll just cancel prom. So you think about, what kind of effect it has on a person where I have to police myself, or me not policing myself affects my entire student body. Everybody is frustrated and angry with me. But, that's just, I think, a microcosm to a lot of the things that happen in school to prison pipeline. If you look at some of the infrastructures of the classrooms, some classrooms have no windows, and it's just these small blocks. And it's like, what kind of mental space are you putting yourself in? And so it's not necessarily always this direct correlation where this, like the last young lady said, this, I got suspended 3 times, therefore I dropped out of school, therefore I went to prison. It could be I policed myself, and because I policed myself, I didn't want to have the consequences of being suspended. I was driven to be pushed out. Or even if they did graduate, what effects does that have on somebody psychologically who's trying to, instead of having school to prison pipeline, having a pipe dream to, a pipe dream to an actual real to realizing that dream. And so I think body policing is something that is very, very important in terms of the school to prison pipeline, and it's very difficult to know that how much of it happens, because a lot of times it's something that you don't see.
Wow, thank you, Charles, for telling that. That was a powerful answer, and I think the story really illustrates, like you said, the kind of consequences that we see from decisions that schools are making that affect the lives of young people from a tangible standpoint, but also, like you said, from that emotional and things that you really can't see or measure sometimes. We actually got, I think, a couple more questions coming in on Twitter here, so I want to make sure we are engaging those folks. This one is from Maria C. Fernandez. She wants to know, and assuming she's talking about school to prison pipeline, I believe she is. She says, what's the alternative? Is it restorative justice? Is it beyond that? So I just want to put that question to the panel here. What do we see as solutions, alternatives to the practices that kind of make up the school to prison pipeline right now? If we could we go to Nafisa and Bahira first? If y'all have a response, I mean, you don't have to. But what kind of alternatives are y'all calling for in Ohio, and what do you think? I think this actually leads to another bigger question I was wanting to ask, which is just like, what do we want to see instead of it? Instead of a school to prison pipeline, what do we want for our school?
I think counseling would help most kids. Maybe like counseling and alternatives rather than getting kicked out. Maybe like extra help. Maybe get extra help to to help better their like response to the teacher or their behavior in class.
Well, I think that makes a lot of sense, right? So I think what I hear y'all saying is, or what I hear you saying is, what are that we need alternative ways of intervening when we have student behaviors that we feel like aren't the right and aren't the right way or aren't appropriate, right? So counseling rather than kicking a student out is a great example of that. Other folks, what do we see young people pushing for in terms of alternatives? What are the solutions? What kind of schools do we want?
Yeah, I think to answer that, I think we also have to take a step back and really look at the trajectory of education, particularly for African Americans and people of color in this country, and our contribution to that. So when we think about education and we look at the fact that public schools comes out of the Reconstruction and was policy that was advanced by black policymakers. When we advanced 50 years ago to Freedom Summer, we have, again, another kernel, another vision of what schools could be like, this idea that schools are a space of transformation, a space of building power. And then you advance it even 10 years after that with the Panther Party. And so you have what started out as a breakfast program, young people being hungry, feeding their stomachs and feeding their minds, actually preparing them for school, leading to liberation schools and the creation of that, and on some levels, this idea of alternative education. So what's next? I think, again, we'll continue to emerge out of our struggle to build education. I think when we look at the National Student Bill of Rights, it begins to lay out a very firm structure by which we can build a new education. I think that's where we're at, that we're clear, everyone's clear, from the federal government to state to local, that our schools have been made into prisons. And there's no fighting that fact now. So the question then becomes, what kind of schools are we going to build, and whose hands are going to build them? And I do think that young people have the capacity, the skill, and the passion, along with adults, along with communities, to really build new schools to drive us into a new century.
Yeah, I think it's an issue. Like, instead of looking at the policies of, do we do school? So we shouldn't do school to prison pipeline. What else should there be? I think that's more reactionary to something. I think we need to start with the source of these problems, and is why are children doing these things, or why are children feeling like they, I say this, why the school to prison pipeline come to be out to be, and I feel like part of that is a value system. The system does not necessarily value the students, and sometimes the students do not necessarily value themselves, in which I feel like they should. And part of that is educating someone. So when you have some, if you were to go in the classroom with some kindergartners and ask them what they want to be, no one in there would say they wanted to live some type of lifestyle of crime or negativity or any of those things. They all would give you these, oh, I want to be a basketball player, I want to be a lawyer, I want to be the President of the United States. And so we have to think about how are we doing to cultivate these dreams. And so I look back at my high school, and some of the frustrations I saw was that, only about 10% of the school was valued. You either had to be a straight A student or be an athlete, right? And so statistically, you're not going to have that many athletes, and you're not going to have that many straight A students. So what are you doing to motivate the other 90% of the school? And what ends up happening is nothing. So if I cannot be those two things, or if I'm not those two things, then you have this instance where I feel like I am being devalued, and then it leads to other things. I think we need to start looking at education holistically, like just as colleges accept and think about, what kind of community they're building. I think our public educational system needs to think about what kind of community they are building and what kind of community they should build. And with that, is so you may have a student that's a C student who can't play a lick of basketball, but they're good with their hands and they can be a carpenter, right? So how do you cultivate that person who wants to be a carpenter, instead of telling them, oh, you have no value, you good with your hands, that doesn't mean enough. Getting them to understand, if you want to be a carpenter, be the best carpenter you can be, and this is why algebra is important to that, right? And so we don't do, I think, a good job in most public schools of cultivating students to be the best that they can be. And I think that is how we answer the problem of school to prison pipeline. I noticed that I feel like if you empower a student and make them feel like they have value, then the way that they respond to themselves is differently, and the way they respond to each other is differently. And so that's what I would like to see, is maybe a shifting of conversation between, like, let's tear down these school to prison pipeline policies, to let's create policies that make students feel like they have value.
Yeah. I feel like that's important. One of the things that that we've been saying as Freedom Side is our lives matter, right? And we're saying that to these systems that we matter, but we're also saying it to ourselves and to our community, right? That our lives matter, our young people have value, like you're saying, Charles. I think that's crucial. I feel like I cut somebody off just now. Was there somebody else who was trying to jump in there?
It wasn't really a cutoff. I just wanted to add sort of a piece. I think in thinking about sort of Maria's question, I think that I could speak on how NSBR is connected to that for 2 hours. But I think there are three major things that sort of come to mind immediately. The first is that schools need to be controlled by their community, and everyone that is a part of the community needs to support that process. And I think that when you sort of, I don't want to say give that power to, but sort of hold space for that community to have that power, whatever works for them and their children and their community will be effective for them. And so I think that's sort of one of the shifts that we have to sort of think about. I think the second one is within the school. If maybe community power is too big of a thing to think about, within a school, I think it's important to have the people that are sort of retaining all aspects of the education are connected directly to curriculum building, how their infrastructure is within the school, like who has power, and so on and so on. I think that yes, young people need to have a lot more power in schools, but I also think we shouldn't devalue what teachers bring to the table, right? We shouldn't devalue how parents feel their child should be treated with respect and dignity. And so I think that's another important piece. And just the last thing, there's something around like tokenism in schools. It's one of the things that I faced a lot in high school, and it became a real problem and made it so that it wasn't important for me anymore to be able to speak on behalf of other young people in my school, right? And so I think it's important that we create sort of a process in which expectation across the board is that young people will succeed, teachers will succeed at teaching, parents will be supportive of their school and their community, and those things I think are sort of some of the shifting products in which will help everyone in the community be valued. I think the young people should, yes, spearhead that, but I don't think we can move this thing without everyone being included.
Yeah, one of the things I often ask myself is, what if students went to school not because it was compulsory, because that's what it is, but what if it was a right, right? And I think that opens us up to education being around, and then also to Amantala's point, I think for me, understanding schools in terms of, again, how we're developing communities and nations, like high schools are the springboard into adulthood, and so for me, and then education is about this preparation for democracy, and it's always the question I think with NSBR for folk is, what are we preparing our students for? So what democracy are we preparing our students to live in the schools that we created for them? And it's very clear that we're preparing them for prison, because in prison you don't get to participate in democracy, and young people don't get to participate in democratizing of their education. And I think that's a particular fulcrum that opens us up to a lot of new possibilities, and unleashes the imagination of young people to transform public education. And to be really radical, like Ella Baker talked about, facing a system that's not designed to meet your needs and figuring out a way to make it meet your needs.
All right. A Freedom Side discussion wouldn't be complete without at least one Ella Baker quote, so thank you, Jonathan. But no, these are really important pieces, and I think we're getting to the point where now we're talking about what do we want to see in our schools, not just offering a critique of what's currently happening. We had another question on Twitter that I think is really pertinent as we enter like the last 10 minutes of this conversation. And this question came from Samuel Singyangwe. I know I'm getting your name wrong, brother. I apologize for that. But we do appreciate the question. And his question is really the ultimate question for this panel. And as we head go forward into the next few months, we got an election coming up. A lot of people will be voting around the country. There's a lot of work to be done at the polls and otherwise. His question is, what do young activists need right now to strengthen and build the national momentum to win on these issues? So what are the things people need in terms of resources, in terms of strategy, in order to win on this vision that we want for our schools? That's a question for anybody.
There's a question basically like, what do we need now in schools to like better kids and so you know school to prison pipeline?
Well, I think that may be what he's getting to. I think my interpretation of the question was what do you all need in order to win and eliminate zero tolerance in Ohio, right? That's the goal of your campaign, is to get zero tolerance off the books as state law in Ohio. So what do you think it's going to take for you all to win? What do you think is the path towards that kind of victory? I believe is his question.
I think for me, again, in my understanding of movement history, I keep talking about this Greensboro moment, And again, when we understand the history of social change in this country, and particularly related to young folk, the adults, we passed all the policies, we got all the laws on the books, and then we got complacent. We sat on our hands, and young people said, no, we're going to confront this. And so you have 4 young men walk into a Woolworths in Greensboro, North Carolina, to start the sit-in movement that directly confronted white apartheid in the South, and sparked a movement, a national movement that gave it, something that every young person can do. And I think that's where we're at. We need to figure out what is that Greensboro, what is that tactic that every young person, when they are faced with suspensions or they know their friends being faced with suspensions, that they can intervene and that we can again confront it and begin accelerate its dismantling. And I think that's, again, goes back to this idea that should be the daily work, the daily task of every young person, is how we dismantle the school to prison pipeline to clear the field so that we can build the kind of schools that we want to see in our communities. So we got to go to work.
I think I would just say that I think it's important to recognize and think about, do we have a collective and shared analysis and vision around what it is that we want? Because in reality, most people actually value similar things, right? So we value life. Most people hopefully value love. But not all of us necessarily put it into the terms of, like, we value liberation. And if we talk about it, we do value that, right? But do some people feel like they can even be free? Do they feel like they have the ability to sort of, as a young person, be able to say, I should be superintendent of my schools, right? Like, that's a thing. So I think being able to identify the problem and being able to create collective and shared vision and their analysis for it helps us to sort of vie for that initial process. And then I think there's a lot of work that comes after that, but I think that's sort of the initial thing. I also think there's something around support that young people need, because all of us have the ability to sort of support ourselves in this work, I think, but it's not easy to do it without people that care about you and love and respect you. And so for me, it seems that if you start to build around you sort of I don't want to say a military or a militant base of people that will support you and move with you, but building your base is so important. And if you are fighting for something that people don't believe in, you got to rethink what it is that you're processing, right? And so you don't go up to someone and say, well, do you believe that people should have access to housing, right? Because most people are gonna say yes. And so I think it's important to think about, how do we begin to like put that into our own sort of visioning, but having it then be, of course, translated into work.
Yeah, I think that's basically that kids need like supportive people in the back to support them and encourage them, and like reassure them that, okay, you have a dream to be a lawyer, you can do that. I think that it's to like society now and say, okay, there's really not many colored people in government, so my dream of being like a lawyer or a House representative or something like that, I can't do that because nobody else is doing it. So they look to something else and say, like, things in school that we're learning now, okay, it's not gonna help us, so why should we learn it? So it's like that in school because we don't really need it so much. So we have somebody there to tell you, like, you need this, you need to, if you want to be this, you need to pay attention to school and get education so you can be and you can pursue your dream.
I, I feel like it's an issue of viewpoint. We have to start viewing ourselves through our own lenses instead of viewing ourselves through the lenses of others. So when we talk about young people, and I think that I echo the sentiments of the last people who were speaking. Um, Oftentimes, a young person view themselves through the lenses of an adult that's in the room or the authority, instead of realizing that they have the power. Yeah. We would not have teachers, we would not have schools, we would not have superintendents, we would not have school to prison pipeline if it wasn't for young people. Young people create this environment and this reality. And once we realize that we do that, and also that since we do create this reality, we have the power to alter it. And so I think it's an instance where everybody is thinking it, but no one is saying it out loud. So to answer the question, what do young activists need right now? That they need each other. You need to start having these conversations in the classroom, like the young ladies are having in Ohio with the Ohio Student Justice Alliance. I'm sorry, Ohio Student Association. Start having these conversations after school. You know, what do you believe your civil rights are? What do you believe your civil liberties are as young people in school? And from there, you can begin to organize and say, well, we all have a consensus around this issue. We should move around this issue. And I think that you'll be really surprised that you have a lot of allies out there. I'm not going to lie to you, you may have a few foes, but I guarantee you there are a lot of teachers, a lot of parents, and a lot of community people who would agree with you and probably say, I'm so glad that you stood up and said what I couldn't say, or you stood up and said what I've been saying, but it was only heard until you said it. So, you know, like I said, to answer that question, I think young people need each other and start the conversation.